And there it is. Recording is now in progress.
Okay, thanks very much, Bob. So yeah, my name's Kevin O'Reilly. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake, and I was invited by Alternatives North to make a presentation today. And I'm going to share my screen. Do I need to do that again, Bob?
Yeah, you just click on share screen and then click on the screen you want to share.
Okay. And can folks see that now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So the title of my talk is the NWT Getting Enough from Mining. And the next slide is, how do I get there?
Spacebar might do it.
Nope. Try down, enter.
I think you might need to have your actual PowerPoint screen open so that you can.
Should I stop sharing them for a second?
Sure.
Okay, and I'll just go to share screen again, and I'll try that. Can you see that one okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, and then I think I can resume slideshow. All right, so enter. There we go. Sorry, folks, technical difficulties. So here's the outline of my presentation. And I'm going to try to do this in about 20 minutes to make sure that there's some time for questions afterwards. And so quickly, I'll talk a little bit about regulation of mining in the Northwest Territories.
So it's not progressing. We can just see the small ones on the.
It hasn't synced up with us yet.
Oh, is it on the presentation page?
It's on the first. It's on the first
Slide. Okay, I'm on the second slide. Not sure how to get that going.
Maybe just make that left-hand panel much bigger, and then we can just read them off that side.
The left-hand panel.
Yeah, we don't see the presentation mode yet, Kevin.
We're just seeing the PowerPoint
Okay.
page, the actual PowerPoint page.
Bob, you may have to provide permission for Kevin to proceed.
Okay,
Should I stop sharing?
just for a moment.
Yep.
Make you a co-host.
Gordon sounds like an expert.
Yes.
This is all intentional on Kevin's part to, build the anticipation. Like, oh, we just
Well,
can't wait now.
it's really about transparency or lack thereof, I guess.
Okay, you are now the host.
Whoa, that's a scary thought. Okay, so I'll go back to, no, not that one, this one. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Oh, all right.
That's the second.
There's a thing.
We're seeing the second one.
Perfect. There's a thing here about admitting Lachlan. Should I do that or should you?
Yes, you'll have to because I can't.
Okay.
I'm not hosting anymore.
Okay, sorry about all of that, folks. I think we're over most of the technical difficulties. So here's what I'd like to talk about today. Regulation of mining in the Northwest Territories. Some of the benefits from mining revenues, transparency, fairness, talk a little bit about the mining fiscal regime, and then leave some time at the end for questions and answers. And how do I get this to go?
Try using the
Right,
space
the
bar.
space
again.
bar.
Space bar, yeah.
I tried that and nothing's happening. I try enter, the down thing, and nothing's happening.
Kevin, can you try just clicking on the screen there?
Sure. And nothing's,
There,
whoa, okay. Sorry about that. So regulation of NWT mining, that's not the one I wanted, but okay, here we are.
you went through 2.
Thanks. So I think I'm on, can you see 3?
You're on
Yeah.
3.
Perfect. So Indigenous governments own some pockets of subsurface lands through their land rights agreements. The feds still own some lands here, largely for conservation purposes. But GNWT is really the main land manager now since devolution in 2014. The Mineral Resources Act was passed in 2019. It's not yet in force. What it does is really regulate mining rights and royalties. And it's really, quite frankly, going to take years to implement because it's quite complicated and a whole bunch of matters require a lot of work. But mining activities in themselves continue to be regulated within the existing co-management regime for land and water. The main department for GNWT's Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment, and they really have an inherent conflict of interest because they promote mining and regulate it at the same time. In terms of other sort of aspects of mining, there's public subsidies and investment to support mining. For example, the Slave Geological Province Road, Leach Oil Season Road, and another form of subsidy that is often not talked about a lot is closure and reclamation costs, and certainly the track record in the past is not a good one. So that often involves a form of public subsidy when some of these properties require government intervention. And of course, Giant Mine down the road is probably the worst example of that. So I want to move on to some of the benefits from mining, and I'm going to take this at a fairly high level. 2020, 2021 were not typical years. So if I go back to 2019, mining was 27% of our gross domestic product here in the Northwest Territories. And diamond mining alone has been a low of about 7%, up to as high as 42% in recent years. Of course, there are jobs created through mining. And in terms of the overall resource sector, though, it can be as low as 6% or as high as about 11% in 2007. So in terms of Northern and Indigenous employment at the 4 diamond mines, it's been roughly about 51% over the period that they've operated. 25% of the management positions are held by Northerners at the diamond mines, and the rest are folks from away or outside. From 1996 to 2019, 70% of the NWT mine procurement was with Northern and Indigenous businesses for $23 billion. And obviously, when that money is spent in our economy, it creates and stimulates additional activity in other sectors. I'm not going to read off the numbers. All of that is there for you. And there's a report that's issued by GNWT every few years that kind of captures some of these numbers as well. One of the main mechanisms that is used to try to capture socioeconomic benefits are these socioeconomic agreements. They set non-binding targets for hiring, contracting, procurement, training during the various phases of a mining operation. And there's some monitoring and public reporting that takes place under these socioeconomic agreements. But if those targets are not reached, there's really no consequences. There's no penalties, there's no sanctions. There can be meetings and attempts to try to improve, but nothing of much consequence, really. The early agreements were particularly weak. They didn't even contain requirements for a Northern office or legacy investments. And those things are often done in other jurisdictions. So all 4 of the diamond mines have fallen short of their socioeconomic agreement employment commitments. And I just list the track record for each of the mines there. So I think it's clear that these agreements are not really that great when it comes to capturing benefits. Training and apprenticeship commitments have generally been met. Women make up about 14% of the workforce at the mines, which is comparable to the national mining industry. There's also some socioeconomic monitoring that happens under those agreements, and the community wellness scores have been developed. But those have actually started to decrease from 2011 to 2016, and the last set of data that I saw, and it's been a while since I've looked at it, I will confess, but Yellowknife leads in these community wellness scores. Regional centers are behind them, and the small communities at the bottom. What is clear, though, is that this gap between Yellowknife and small communities has not really closed in any way during the period where diamond mining has taken place. So a lot of the wealth continues to be concentrated in Yellowknife, and the regional disparities continue. And most of that will probably not come as a great surprise to many of you. So let's shift now to talk a little bit about some of the mining revenues. These are revenues that come to government from mining, and of course royalties is one of them. And they range from 0 to 14% of all production, and it sort of caps out though at $45 million. Royalties are sensitive to profits that are being made, and there's lots of deductions that can be made, and I list some of them there, but even like production costs can be written off against what is calculated as royalties at the end of the day. I'll talk a little bit about corporate taxes now. 11.5% of taxable income can go to GNWT if the taxes are actually filed in the Northwest Territories, and they don't necessarily have to be. The corporate tax rate for the feds is 15%. Corporate taxation is not reported by mine. There's what the amounts have been over a period of time. They've been as low as corporate taxes in their entirety, $22 million, and as high as 108. Folks will remember back in 1998, John Todd talking about when we were getting into diamond mining that he would bring in a tax that would choke a mule if the diamond companies would not agree to sell some of their diamonds locally. And the theory was that we would get some trickle down benefits. Unfortunately, that approach has really failed, whereas we could have captured more revenues perhaps through the tax system. Diamond mines and mining operations outside of municipal boundaries also can pay property taxes, or do pay property taxes to GNWT. In some other jurisdictions that it doesn't happen. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact figures, but it's not a huge amount there. Of course, mines also pay fuel taxes of a couple of different kinds. There's a fuel excise tax, and these are basically for fuels that are used for power on site, haul trucks, processing equipment. Mines also pay a carbon tax now on fuels, but most of that is actually rebated back to the fuel purchaser. There is a small amount that's kept behind in individualized accounts, although none of that money has actually been used yet for investing into energy projects. We all pay a payroll tax in the Northwest Territories. It's 2% of our income, and NWT residents that live here and file their taxes here, we get a cost of living tax credit that basically reimburses us for the payroll taxes. About half the workers, as I said, at the diamond mines are from outside of the NWT, so we get to keep the payroll tax that they submit. There are issues, though, around if we wanted to increase a payroll tax in terms of charter rights. That could lead it open to a challenge. Payroll taxes amount to about $40 million annually. I want to shift now to talk a little bit about transparency. And NWT royalty information is treated as highly confidential by certainly our government and the federal government before devolution. The only public reporting that takes place is through something called the public accounts. Basically, these are like the financial statements for the Northwest Territories. And what you get is a combined figure for both mining and petroleum royalties that are paid, and actually water fees as well, as I discovered recently. And before 2014, before devolution, the figures that were reported also included Nunavut. So it's difficult to really separate out exactly what the NWT is getting, and you can't actually see how much we actually get from mines. As reported though in the public accounts over a number of years, and I compiled that information. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but they've been pretty low back in 2000, but as high as $144 million in 2004. A lot of it has to do with when companies are writing off assets and go into production and so on. So there's a lot of variation in the amount of royalties that are paid to the territorial government. And before devolution, we didn't get anything. But there is a global movement towards more open and transparent reporting of government revenues from the extractive sector, and that's largely to prevent bribery and corruption. And that it's called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It started in 2004 as a partnership. 54 countries have signed on. Canada is a supporting country along with many of the more developed countries in the world. Canada doesn't actually sign on to it, but we implement it through something called the Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act. Why Canada has not signed on is because it's the provinces and the territories for the most part that have jurisdiction over natural resources. So as a country, Canada has not signed on, but there is some reporting of payments to governments. And there's the criteria for reporting under the federal legislation. I'm not going to review that for you, but the kinds of payments that are reported are fees, royalties, and taxes. And even payments to Indigenous governments are now reported as of 2017. The diamond mines and other mines in the Northwest Territories, when they are in production, are part of the self-reporting system. But I can tell you, having combed through the data for the Northwest Territories, that there's a lot of issues with the reporting period. There seems to be some confusion over royalties versus taxes. It's a self-reporting system. There's no quality control on the data that's submitted and posted to the NRCan federal website. And I've found lots of discrepancies or inconsistencies even in the NWT data that's been submitted. And I just want to say that what these reports under the ESTMA legislation show is not what GNWT reports as money from resource revenues. I've tried to reconcile it, impossible to do. It's out by tens of millions of dollars. And that's just because they report different things and over different periods of time as well. So let's switch now to talk a little bit about some fairness about mining revenues to government in particular. And I just want to give you a little bit of background about where GNWT gets some of its revenues. And most of you probably know some of this. GNWT, we actually get most of our money from the federal government, about 80%. And then the remaining 20% is sort of considered our own source revenues that we raise through taxes and royalties and so on. At one time, for every $1 that we raised in our own revenues, $1.15 was clawed back by the federal government. What a crazy arrangement. That has since changed. Now the clawback is less, and it depends on a whole bunch of different things. But I can tell you that the territorial formula funding arrangement is complicated, and what we are rated against is the tax effort and sort of how we rank against other Canadian provinces and jurisdictions in terms of a whole variety of indicators and tax effort and so on. There's a regular rebalancing of our overall expenditures over time to deal with inflation and growth. And we do get more money generally over time from the federal government to deal with those. We get to keep all the taxes that we raise, but they tend to kind of get flattened out over time because of this rebalancing through this funding arrangement. So in 2014, though, we start to keep some of the revenues from resources ourselves now directly, and that's through the devolution agreement through this net fiscal benefit. So we get to keep 50% of the resource revenues that are raised. And it's tied to, there's a cap on that, and it's basically comes out to 5% of the previous year's budget. We've never, ever even got close to that cap since devolution. And I think the royalties or revenues that we do keep are far below what was originally predicted and promised, but that's a different story. Indigenous governments get 25% of what GNWT gets to keep in terms of resource revenues. And that's also negotiated under the devolution agreement. The revenues to Indigenous governments have generally been about $3 to $8 million per year over since devolution. I think on a previous slide, I basically indicated that royalties and corporate taxes fluctuate wildly over the since devolution. Fuel taxes and payroll taxes tend to remain a little more constant, and they have shown some steady growth. The only detailed study that I'm aware of that actually talks about government revenues from mining was done a few years back. Around gold mining in the Yellowknife region over a period of time. And that showed that personal income taxes paid by workers actually was higher than the corporate taxes paid by the mine, and that royalties actually were a very small part of the overall government revenue from gold mining over that period of time. What I've seen reported by GNWT is that they estimate their annual revenues from diamond mines to be about $100 million annually. So that would include all of those taxes that I talked about. The Bureau of Stats also tracks the value, though, of diamonds that are exported. And over the time that diamonds have been exported, starting about 1998, 1999, there's $30 billion worth of diamonds that have left the Northwest Territories. So we've been able to capture maybe about $1 billion in revenues over that period of time, which is about 3% of the value of those diamonds as a government, GNWT. And some of it went to the feds before devolution as well. But so there's also an issue, though, about how we share benefits across generations, because, of course, minerals are a one-time natural wealth, natural capital. And of course, Alternatives North did a lot of work to try to get a heritage fund established, and one set up in 2012. But there are issues with it. There's no public governance. There's no defined revenue stream, but by convention, 25% of the revenues that GNWT, the royalties, the resource revenues that we get are put into the heritage fund on an annual basis. You may be surprised to learn that the fund was actually losing ground against inflation, partly because of the very conservative investment policies that were in place for the fund. Those were changed in 2019 to be a little bit more liberal, small L liberal, and management of the fund has now been contracted out to the private sector. There is to be a review of the Heritage Fund that's supposed to start, I believe, later this year or next. The Heritage Fund is about $34 million now. And at the current rate of growth, it's going to take a long, long time to actually amount to anything that could be used to stabilize or meaningfully diversify our economy for future generations. So here's one take on fairness as well that I want to share with you. And this was a study done by Andrew Bauer. He's with an organization called the Natural Resource Governance Institute. He was hired by GNWT to do a benchmarking study using an international framework. And he gave our government basically a failing grade when it came to the mining fiscal regime. And basically what he said here is that we have one of the world's most charitable fiscal regimes for the mining sector, one that captures between 20 to 30% of economic rents from mining projects. And as you can see, we don't really compare very favorably to other parts of the world when it comes to capturing these mining benefits. So now, royalties were supposed to be considered during the development of the Mineral Resources Act. They were one of the themes that was to be explored, but at the end of the day, GNWT said that they were just going to keep the royalties regime in place, and that they would have to work with devolution partners in the future to modify that. So nothing was done about royalties back in 2019 when the Mineral Resources Act was passed. Just grandfathered, and it's not yet enforced, as I said. But what was said during that review of the Mineral Resources Act by organizations and Indigenous governments was that there needed to be greater transparency around the mining fiscal regime, the revenues to government, and that if there is to be a review carried out, that should be done publicly. So lo and behold, GNWT, through the Industry Tourism and Investment, did launch its review of the mining fiscal regime in October of 2020. And they did another benchmarking study by PricewaterhouseCoopers, accounting firm. And they sort of had a couple of theoretical mines that they set up, a diamond mine and a base metal mine. And then they ran that through what revenues would come to government under 21 different regimes in different places, including the NWT. So it wasn't really a revenue study so much as looking at the competitiveness of the NWT compared to these other jurisdictions. So, and of course, what did the study conclude? Well, that we're competitive against other regimes. And then interestingly enough, they said the best way to increase revenues from mining is to promote more mining. So as regular MLAs, we did get that study, and I sit on the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. We said, you know what, we need to do our own review of this. So we hired a world-class consultant, Resources for Development, and we asked those consultants to review that Price Waterhouse study, or the ITI study as I call it. And this is what these other consultants said. They said that, the ITI study really only looked at competitiveness. It didn't look at maximizing government revenues. The jurisdictions that were selected really give the impression that the NWT is comparable and only slightly more generous than most other jurisdictions, which means we actually capture less money. That the NWT gets, quote, some of the lowest government take in the world for minerals. And that there really should be a historical performance of the NWT fiscal regime undertaken. And you also need to consider that fiscal arrangement with Ottawa that I talked about in looking at ways to maximize revenues from mining. And they calculate that GNWT roughly gets about 22% of mining revenues, maybe, and the feds get 14%, whereas the International Monetary Fund recommends government should get between 40 and 60% of the revenues. So that consultant recommended, and those recommendations were brought forward by all the MLAs into the House and accepted. Of course, Cabinet always abstains on these sort of things when they come forward, but the recommendation was that there should be a performance of the actual mining fiscal regime in place since devolution. Look at how well it's actually captured revenues and retained them for us. There should be a government-led revenue transparency. We should be focusing on maximizing government revenues. Look at the net revenues that we get to keep as a government after devolution and revenue sharing with Indigenous governments, which of course should take place. And that we should really try to find ways to generate more revenues for future generations as well. And that there's probably opportunities for more benefits to Indigenous governments as well. And that really information about this mining fiscal regime review needs to be made public. There needs to be the clear steps, a timeline, and opportunities for public engagement as we move forward. So I just want to go back now to a minute to I talked about the lack of transparency, lack of public reporting of mining revenues. And you should know that regular MLAs and Indigenous governments, we don't get any greater access to mining revenues than what the public does. And that's as a result of the way the legislation has been written. But Cabinet and the public service actually can access and get that information. it with certain confidentiality requirements around that, of course, but as regular MLAs and Indigenous governments, we don't get any information. So I've developed a private members bill to try to deal with this, to give the ITI minister discretion to share resource royalty information with regular MLAs and Indigenous governments with proper, and that the minister could put on terms and conditions around confidentiality to make sure that that's protected. So the bill's before the House, and it was reviewed by a standing committee. The committee did not make any recommendations or changes, even though some were suggested in submissions. So it's back to the House to consider. And I can talk more about that if people have questions, but it's my view that MLAs and Indigenous governments, we need to have more information about resource royalties. And really, it's a complicated issue of trying to find the right balance between competing interests, profits to shareholders, the economic benefits we get from mining, making sure that we get a fair return to government for this one-time natural capital, and how do we make sure that the benefits from mining are distributed better across the Northwest Territories and across generations. So basically, I'm waiting to see what the government is going to do on this front. There's supposed to be some sort of a paper discussion, some next steps released soon. I don't know when. But I'm waiting to see what happens with that before I decide what to do with the bill itself. So there's in a very quick high-level overview of a whole bunch of things related to how we try to capture benefits, and there are benefits obviously from mining. I didn't talk about costs because I wanted to focus on benefits and the revenues, and a little bit about fairness and transparency, but at a very high level, I went through that all very quickly, but happy to try to answer any questions that people may have. And thanks again for the invitation. And should I exit my screen?
Yeah, stop sharing your screen.
Okay, thank you.
I just
Okay,
had,
does anyone have any questions?
I just wanted a clarification on employment, because I didn't quite understand. There's 6 to 11% of employment in the NWT is in the resource sector. That was back in slide 5. Yeah, and then 50% of that is northern.
No. Yeah, they're separate statistics. What I said, I think, was that what I wanted to try to give a sense of was that, there are jobs generated from the resource sector. They generally amount to about less than 10% of the workforce, though. The jobs that are generated at the diamond mines, only about half of those are filled by Northerners and Indigenous peoples.
Okay, yeah, that's what I understood. So there's not a huge amount of employment from mining is what it comes down to, percentage-wise.
Yeah, now there are other jobs created through suppliers to the mines and contracting and some of that other activities, but and I'm sure the Chamber of Mines or even ITI can give you all of those kind of
multiplier effects
and all of that kind of stuff. But I was looking at these socioeconomic reports that and some stats from the Bureau of Stats, and I'm not a statistician, but I was trying to give folks a sense of there are benefits from mining. Sometimes people may have different ideas about what those benefits may be. So I just thought it would be worthwhile to throw some of those stats into the presentation.
Kevin, Ben here. An observation, first of all, you said that the revenues, one of the examples you used was comparing revenues to South Africa, Peru, and Western Australia. And one of the arguments that are made in the Northwest Territories for requiring lower revenues from the mining industry is our isolation. South Africa, I don't know the situation there, but Peru is mountains and Western Australia is desert. I mean, do you think it's a legitimate position that the mining industry takes in the context of where mining is going on these days? They're getting more and more remote.
Yeah, no, well, I guess I would answer in a couple of different ways. You know, the resources are found where the resources are found, and there's no getting away from the geography. Some countries obviously and regions have way better infrastructure and transportation systems, and that is a criticism of the Northwest Territories, is that we don't have a great infrastructure system or transportation systems. But at the same time, the way that royalties in particular are calculated, and probably corporate taxes to some extent, companies get to write off their operating expenses or deduct those from payments made to government. So they do have higher operating costs, and you know they have to be mindful of how that figures into their economics and so on. But in terms of government revenues, those factors are already accounted for because they get to write off operating costs. They get to certainly against royalties. So the royalties in particular are profit sensitive, as corporate taxes are as well. So I don't think that argument really holds a lot of sway with me personally, because those things are already accounted for in the way that government revenues are calculated.
I can move to the second one. You referred to legacy investments in other jurisdictions. What sort of thing is that?
Well, I can say that in the NICO Fortune Socioeconomic Agreement, one negotiated here, and the latest one that was negotiated here, there is to be a legacy project negotiated, I believe, in the Tlicho region. And I don't have the details at me, and there I think there might even be like a number figure in terms of the amount of money that the project should come to. Another example, though, would be the Voisey's Bay Agreement with the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. In that agreement, there was very significant investment that's required in the province. They have to have a head office in the province. They had to agree to process their ore in the province, and they had to construct a new facility in the Avalon Peninsula for that. They got money to go into Memorial University. There was requirements that management staff would be located in the north, in Newfoundland and Labrador. Way better arrangement than we ever got with the diamond mines, and that literally would require Inco to put tens of millions of dollars into higher education, head office location, all of those good things. Other kinds of legacy projects that have been done by other mining companies. I went to Papua New Guinea probably 15 years ago, and BHP actually turned over the operation at Oktedi at some point to the Papua New Guinea government and gave them money to look at how to diversify the local economy, because a community had sprung up in basically what was rainforest with 15,000 people there, and they were afraid that if the mine closed, people would basically starve to death. So that the company did give the assets to the government, but also gave them some money to look at ways to diversify the economy. So it's not necessarily just corporate welfare that's handed out, but governments have to look at what comes after mining and how you can try to get some legacy that for future generations as well. And partly, I think that was one of the reasons why the Heritage Fund was set up here. But as I mentioned in my presentation, issues around the Heritage Fund itself.
Thanks.
Kevin, I have a question for you about the cost of administration and whether you know what it costs ITI to administer the mining part of the department? And how does that number compare with royalties?
Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't actually looked that up. Maybe it's difficult to kind of sort through that in the public accounts or the main estimates, at least what's available publicly, might give a clear understanding of what the administration costs are. But I can tell you that ITI is one of the smaller departments within GNWT, and the mining and petroleum resources division is, I think, maybe about, if I recall correctly, maybe about 30–40% of the department. So, and then of course, only a portion of that would really be for mineral rights administration royalty. But there are, like, yeah, certain staff positions and ways of that could be used to calculate that cost. And that should be part of the questions that are asked during the fiscal review as well.
Yeah, Kevin, Bob here, can you hear me?
Yep.
So thanks very much for that summary and the analysis you've done. As you say, it's complex, and I appreciated the simplicity provided and the clarity at that level of review. It seems part of the issue is time frame to get things done. I know you're not in there for your whole life, and you know, there's been a lot of effort to try and get things moving, and it's been slow as molasses, as government is. So it's going to take a real proponent to keep it moving. What's your sense? Like, is your bill before the House now? And how do you see things going in this review and making sure that this gets followed to completion?
Yeah, no, very good questions, Bob. People will remember Premier Bob McLeod talking about, we want devolution, and then we're devolve and then evolve. Well, we're still waiting for the evolve more than 7 years after devolution. Now we're only starting to talk about revenues, resource royalties. That's been taking way too long, in my humble opinion. But I think I have to be honest that COVID has really slowed a lot of things down, including the work by ITI on this, and for a whole variety of reasons. Some of it, and part of it is the capacity and desire to work with Indigenous governments, which I think is not just it is the way that we need to do things. So I think there are some issues in terms of getting some of that work done now. But I was in the last assembly when we started to review some of the resource management legislation, and I can tell you that we got a lot of submissions on some of those bills, and the Indigenous governments often made good submissions. The NGOs made very good submissions as well, and those submissions did result in some significant changes to the legislation. Even the Mineral Resources Act, the way that there's now going to be a public registry when it's implemented, and more information is going to be made available to the public as a result of that. There were benefit agreements are going to be a requirement with Indigenous governments. There's to be some kind of benefit arrangements for the public, although that's not spelled out, and I still tried to get that changed. But what I want to say is that the value of NGOs in engaging in the legislative process, you can actually make a difference. And regulations, though, it's not really clear how NGOs are going to can be and will be engaged in the development of regulations, because there's no legal requirement to do that. But I think it's going to be very important to try to stay on top of all of this as it rolls out. And to find MLAs that are willing to try to ensure that there's greater transparency and fairness in this moving forward. I don't know whether we're even going to get regulations before the end of this assembly, which is, November of 23 at this rate. It's very complicated area, and Indigenous governments can and should be and are legally required to be engaged in and involved now. And there's an agreement that sets out that through a protocol that what that process should look like. So there's still lots of work to be done, and I really hope that NGOs can stay engaged and involved in that, and the public as well. And I'll certainly be pushing for more of that. In terms of my own bill, it stays on the order papers until I decide to call it. So I'm kind of decide when the bill would be brought forward. I've been holding back on it just to see if the government is actually going to come forward with any ideas, proposals around transparency and public reporting, or even sharing of information on royalties. Because right now there's no requirement, and she's prohibited from doing it, which is totally ridiculous in my opinion. But the mining industry had a lot of concerns that they raised around the bill. I don't agree with almost all of those concerns that they raised, but they're out there. So there was a submission from the NGOs that I think was helpful, but that's kind of where my bill's at as well. So sorry if I've gone on too long, but there's a lot more work to be done, and I personally value the work that NGOs can bring and do on this, and really encourage that they continue to stay engaged. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just really quickly, another weakness seems to be the self-assessment involved in the process of financial taxes and royalties and so on. Is there any, do you have a sense of, is there any government oversight of that self-assessment process, if you know what I mean? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll come at that maybe from a couple of different angles. I mentioned that there's problems with the federal ESTMA self-reporting system. That's the federal legislation where some companies have to report what they pay to governments. And I found errors in the stuff. There was one year where Ekati was supposed to be paying royalties. They said that they were paying royalties to the government of British Columbia. What? You don't even have a mine in British Columbia. How are you paying royalties to the British Columbia? So I contacted NRCan about that. They said, oh, well, that's not our responsibility. Self-reporting system. We don't do that. You have to take it up with a company. Okay, so then I get a hold of the company, and anyways, they changed ownership, blah, blah, blah. I finally got them. They said, yep, there's a mistake there. We're going to correct it. So it actually got corrected. But that was only one mistake of many that I've seen in there. So self-reporting without oversight, not a good way to try to track revenues and improve fairness and accountability. So but the other sort of GNWT does report through the public accounts, and there is oversight of those through the Auditor General, and the Auditor General does also have the ability to carry out performance audits. And I certainly encourage the Auditor General to look at devolution and the sort of responsibilities our GNWT has now acquired through devolution, and how we're doing with that in terms of a performance audit. So that's something I want to really push, because we got a lot of funding through devolution to resource or to manage resources carefully. Are we doing a good job at that? I think it's mixed, but I think it would be really helpful if there was a third party like the Auditor General to look at that. And then in terms of the oversight of the numbers and what it really means, I think that the best oversight of that is, quite frankly, the public. But if you can't know what the information is, how can the public have any oversight? So we got to get some greater transparency, at least to get started. Thanks.
Thank you.
just quickly, what department does the community wellness scores? Is that Health and Social Services?
Well, as I understand it, it's some kind of index that was sort of developed together between GNWT and the diamond mines. And there's a list of indicators that are where information is collected. I don't have that at my fingertips, but it was negotiated and discussed and agreed upon. And those are reported in these, I think they're annual or every couple of years, ITI issues a diamond mine socioeconomic report. And so the information's found in there, but it's basically some, indicators that the Bureau of Stats already tracks. I don't think they're going out and collecting new information. But that might be an interesting area, whether is it comprehensive enough? Does it capture the right kinds of indicators? And is it really a good measure of community wellness? I think those.
It would appear that we lost Kevin. He has disappeared. So I guess we're going to.
Of all people to lose.
Yeah. How inconvenient. So I think that at this point, it's 1 o'clock. We will end this yeah. Thank you, Kevin, though you can't hear us and you are lost in the ether somewhere. I hope it's not somebody destroying the legislature or anything.
Suzette's still there.
Yeah.
His, yeah, Kevin, come on here. You can come on mine. Okay, then anyway, so he said his computer died on him. So, but it's good if you want to close now.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming, and we'll have this recorded. And hey, Kevin, thank you.
Sorry,
I
just
want to
before
take this back, last bit off, but sorry about that. My computer died on me. I didn't have it plugged in.
Sorry, Rochelle.
just
did you-
Yeah, just before everybody heads out, like Ecology North is working with Alternatives North to host the Green Resilience Project here in Yellowknife as the community partner for the national program. We're currently a little bit of on a pause on the planning part of it because of a lack of a facilitator. So I was hoping to tap into your extensive network and community knowledge. If anybody has anybody in mind to nominate for a facilitator to talk about community resilience and income security and climate change in the North, I would love to hear from you. I'm just going to drop my email down on the chat and I will gladly reach out to them myself, or if any one of you guys are interested to becoming a facilitator yourself.
Can you send a little bit more information about what, is there like an ad or like a job description or any background stuff? That'll be really helpful to get. And you can send it by email. On the Alt North, if you send it to Ben or somebody and they'll get it around.
Yeah, absolutely. I can do that.
Okay, everybody. Well, thank you very much. And we'll just end it off there. Thanks for coming.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.